Welcome back to Shadowed Pages, my dear friends. I'm Edward, and I'm truly delighted to have you join me once again this evening. Where are you tuning in from today, and how has your day been? I always enjoy hearing from you. Leave a comment below, and don't forget to subscribe for a new mystery every day. Now let's begin. Miss Marple sat by the window of the local tea room, the soft hum of conversation mingling with the clinking of teacups and the quiet rustling of the lace curtains. The room was filled with the familiar aroma of freshly baked scones and the comforting warmth of an early spring afternoon. Her attention, however, was not on the conversation around her, but on a particular gathering that had taken place earlier that morning. The village of St. Mary's had long been home to a close-knit group of women who met regularly in the village hall to sew, gossip, and share the latest happenings in their quiet little world. This particular day, however, had been different. The usual chatter had been punctuated by something far darker than the occasional rumor or heated debate over the best tea blend. It had all begun when Eleanor Walters, an elegant widow in her early 70s, had arrived late to the gathering. She was known for her impeccable style and poised demeanor, but today her usual grace seemed to have been replaced by an unsettling air of tension. She had barely greeted the others before she made a beeline for the back of the room, her eyes scanning the group with an unusual intensity. Miss Marple, always keen to observe, had noticed the subtle change in Eleanor's usual composure. Her presence seemed more an intrusion than an addition, and the women around her had begun to whisper. Before anyone could address her behavior, Eleanor had leaned over to speak with Mildred, the oldest member of the group. The conversation had been brief but sharp, and from the way Eleanor's eyes darted nervously around the room, it was clear that something was amiss. It didn't take long for the others to catch wind of her unease, and soon the entire group had been caught in a web of curiosity and concern. But it wasn't until the meeting had broken up and the women began to leave that Miss Marple had received an unexpected visitor. Mildred, the elderly woman who had been conversing with Eleanor, had approached her with a look of worry clouding her usually calm face. "I'm afraid something's wrong, Jane," Mildred had said, using Miss Marple's given name with the intimacy that only the oldest of friends could manage. "There's been talk, rumors. I don't know how much of it is true, but I think Eleanor's involved in something terrible." Miss Marple had raised an eyebrow, but had kept her thoughts to herself. She had always known Mildred to be a woman of great integrity, not one to jump to conclusions without cause. There was clearly something weighing on her mind. "What sort of rumors?" Miss Marple had asked, her voice soft but insistent, her eyes never leaving Mildred's face. She had waited patiently as Mildred hesitated, as though she was deciding whether or not to reveal what she knew. "It's not just talk, Jane," Mildred had replied finally, her voice barely a whisper. "It's the way Eleanor's been acting, her movements, the people she's been meeting. I overheard part of a conversation yesterday. Something about an inheritance. And today, well, I'm not sure, but I think it's more than just the normal village gossip." Miss Marple had listened intently, her mind already working through the possibilities. Inheritance, secrets. These were not things that typically emerged in St. Mary's, where everything was so often in plain sight, so well known to everyone. The very idea of secrecy seemed almost out of place. As Miss Marple had walked back to her small cottage later that afternoon, the sun had dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows over the village lanes. She had pondered Mildred's words and wondered whether this was simply another instance of idle village chatter, or whether there was something more serious at play. That evening, after tea and a light supper, Miss Marple had decided to pay a visit to Eleanor's house. It was not far from the village hall, a modest but well-kept cottage with a small garden out front. As she approached, she noticed a figure standing by the gate, a young woman, her head bowed in deep thought. Miss Marple had recognized her immediately. It was Clara, Eleanor's niece, a young woman who had recently returned to St. Mary's after several years in London. Clara had looked up as Miss Marple approached, her expression tense. "Oh, Miss Marple," Clara had said, a note of surprise in her voice. "I didn't expect to see you here." "Good evening, Clara," Miss Marple had replied kindly. "I was just on my way to see your aunt. Is she at home?" Clara had hesitated before nodding, her gaze shifting uneasily toward the cottage door. "Yes, she's inside," she had said. "But I must warn you, she's been a bit agitated lately. I'm not sure what's going on, but something's troubling her. She's been very secretive." Miss Marple had thanked Clara and walked toward the front door, her mind racing with possibilities. As she knocked, she was greeted by the familiar voice of Eleanor, though it lacked its usual warmth. "Come in, Jane," Eleanor had said, her voice tight but polite. "I'm glad to see you." Inside, Miss Marple had noticed the sharp contrast in Eleanor's demeanor. The woman who had once been so composed now appeared frail, her once perfect appearance now slightly disheveled. The room, too, seemed heavier somehow, as though the walls themselves were closing in on her. "I've been hearing some unsettling things, Eleanor," Miss Marple had begun, her tone gentle but direct. "I think it's time we had a conversation." Eleanor had stiffened, her hands trembling as she placed her teacup down. The silence between them had stretched on for a moment too long. "I don't know what you mean, Jane," Eleanor had replied, her voice barely above a whisper. Miss Marple had studied her closely, noting the signs of stress etched into Eleanor's features. Something had happened, something that Eleanor was desperate to conceal. "You know, Eleanor," Miss Marple had said softly, "in my experience, the truth has a way of coming to light, no matter how carefully it's hidden." Eleanor's eyes had flickered with fear, and for a moment, Miss Marple had thought the woman might collapse under the weight of whatever secret she was harboring. The tension in the room had been palpable, but Miss Marple had not rushed her. She knew that some secrets needed time to surface, and then, as if the walls themselves had begun to crack, Eleanor had spoken, revealing something that would set the course for the investigation to come. "I've been trying to protect them, Jane, but I fear it's too late," she had confessed, her voice barely audible. "The inheritance. It's more dangerous than I ever realized." Eleanor's confession hung in the air, heavy and laden with an unspoken dread. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her sharp eyes fixed on the older woman as she clutched her teacup, her hands trembling slightly. The faint clink of china was the only sound that broke the otherwise silent room. "What do you mean, Eleanor?" Miss Marple asked softly, her voice unwavering but filled with the gentle curiosity that had earned her the trust of so many over the years. Eleanor's eyes darted nervously around the room, as though searching for some unseen presence that might be lurking in the corners of her well-kept sitting room. The lace curtains, which had once seemed so elegant, now appeared almost oppressive, the dim afternoon light casting long shadows across the room. "I never wanted to get involved," Eleanor whispered, her voice barely above a breath. "It's a legacy, an old family secret. But when my late brother's lawyer contacted me a few months ago, I had no choice but to listen." Miss Marple remained silent, her gaze steady and patient. She had long learned the art of waiting, allowing people to find their own words when they were ready. Eleanor seemed to gather herself, taking a shaky breath before continuing. "My brother, Charles, he was always a bit of a mystery," Eleanor began, her eyes glazing over as she thought back to the past. "He had a reputation in the village. Well, not the most reputable one, I should say. But he had money and power, and he made enemies." Eleanor paused, her lips tightening. Not just ordinary enemies, mind you. Dangerous ones. People who would stop at nothing to get what they wanted. Miss Marple nodded slowly, her mind turning over the pieces of the puzzle. The mention of enemies and power, coupled with Eleanor's sudden secrecy, painted a picture of something far more complicated than a simple inheritance. Eleanor's brother had clearly been involved in matters that went beyond the typical concerns of a rural family. and now those matters seemed to be catching up with her. But this inheritance, Miss Marple prompted gently, is it something that could be dangerous? Eleanor's face paled, and she closed her eyes for a moment as though bracing herself against some painful memory. When she spoke again, her voice was strained. "Yes," she murmured. "I had no idea what I was stepping into when I agreed to handle it, but when Charles passed away, the lawyer made it clear there were conditions. Not just legal ones, but moral ones. The kind that haunt you long after you've made your decision." Miss Marple's interest deepened, though she kept her expression neutral. She had no intention of pushing Eleanor too hard, but the older woman seemed to need someone to confide in, and Miss Marple had long been the person people turned to in times of distress. "The lawyer told me that the money, the property, it was all tied to something Charles had done years ago, something he never fully explained," Eleanor continued, her voice trembling. "There were names, dangerous names, Jane, and I think—" She hesitated again, swallowing hard. "I think my brother may have made a deal with someone, a deal that wasn't entirely legal or moral." A chill settled over the room as Miss Marple processed Eleanor's words. A deal. And now, after all these years, it seemed that the shadows of Charles's past were beginning to stir again, reaching out to claim those left behind. "And now you're worried," Miss Marple said quietly, though it wasn't a question, it was a statement of fact. Eleanor nodded slowly, her hands shaking as she set her cup down on the saucer. "I don't know who else to turn to. I've tried to get rid of the inheritance, Jane. I've tried to sell the property, to give it away, but there's always someone watching, always someone waiting. I'm afraid if I don't get rid of it soon, someone will come for me, for the money, for the power, and for whatever my brother was involved in." The words hung in the air, and Miss Marple felt the weight of them pressing down on her. Eleanor was no fool, and yet her fear was palpable. Something far more sinister was unfolding here, something that went beyond the usual squabbles over estates and wills. There were people, dangerous people, who were willing to do anything to reclaim what they believed was rightfully theirs. "And Clara?" Miss Marple asked gently, her thoughts turning to the young woman she had seen outside the cottage earlier. "What does she know about all of this?" Eleanor's expression flickered, a brief flash of uncertainty passing over her face. "Clara, she doesn't know the whole story. I've kept her in the dark for her own good. But she's been asking questions lately. She's not like my brother. She doesn't care about money or power. But she's stubborn, and I fear she may get involved in this, whether I want her to or not." Miss Marple took a deep breath. She had seen this sort of thing before. Family members caught up in the web of a loved one's secrets, unwilling to let go even when the consequences were clear. Clara, despite her apparent innocence, might very well find herself in the same dangerous position that Eleanor was trying so desperately to avoid. "Perhaps it's time to have a word with Clara," Miss Marple said thoughtfully. "It might be that the key to all of this lies in what she knows, or perhaps in what she doesn't." Eleanor looked at her, her eyes wide with fear. "Do you think she's in danger too?" Miss Marple gave her a small, reassuring smile. "I can't say for certain, but it's best to find out now before things get any worse." Eleanor nodded, though her face remained pale, her worry evident. She had already told Miss Marple more than she had planned, and now, with the weight of the secret out in the open, she seemed uncertain of what to do next. Miss Marple, on the other hand, was already thinking ahead. She knew that every piece of the puzzle mattered, and that it was time to dig deeper into the dark corners of the past. There were answers to be found, and she would find them no matter where they led. With a final glance at Eleanor, Miss Marple stood up, her resolve firm. "Don't worry, Eleanor," she said quietly. "I'll do what I can. But for now, you must remain calm. There's no use in panicking." As Miss Marple left the cottage, the weight of the mystery hung over her like a thick fog. The inheritance, the dangerous people, and the secrets buried in the past. These were the threads that would unravel the truth. And though the road ahead promised to be a long one, Miss Marple knew that the answers were just beyond reach. It was only a matter of time before they were brought into the light. The following morning, the village of St. Mary's was as peaceful as ever, the sun casting a soft glow over the cobbled streets and tidy cottages. Miss Marple, however, could not shake the unease that had settled in her chest after her conversation with Eleanor the previous evening. It was as if the village, with all its quiet charm, was merely a facade, hiding secrets that were slowly coming to the surface, each more dangerous than the last. Miss Marple had spent a restless night pondering the puzzle. Eleanor's cryptic words about an inheritance tied to her brother's mysterious past gnawed at her thoughts. The more she considered the situation, the more she realized that there was something far darker at play than just a simple matter of a contested will. It was clear that Eleanor was caught in the middle of something much larger, something that, if left unchecked, could destroy her and everyone around her. After a light breakfast, Miss Marple set out for the village square. It was a place she knew well, where she often walked to clear her mind or to chat with the locals. Today, though, her steps were purposeful. She needed to speak with Clara to understand what the young woman knew or didn't know about her aunt's troubles. Miss Marple had no intention of alarming her, but she knew that the only way to unravel the threads of this mystery was to talk to those closest to the heart of it. As she approached the small bakery on the corner, Miss Marple spotted Clara standing outside, a basket of fresh bread in her hands. The young woman's face was calm, but there was an air of tension about her, as though she were waiting for something. When she saw Miss Marple, she smiled, though the expression didn't quite reach her eyes. "Good morning, Miss Marple," Clara said, her voice warm but with a hint of uncertainty. "I was just getting some bread for Aunt Eleanor. She's not feeling well today." Miss Marple studied her closely, noting the way Clara's hands tightened around the basket as she spoke. The young woman was clearly troubled, though she was doing her best to mask it. Miss Marple could sense the strain in her demeanor, the same way she had seen it in Eleanor the day before. "I'm sorry to hear that Eleanor's unwell," Miss Marple replied, her tone kind but probing. "Is there anything I can do to help?" Clara shook her head, her gaze shifting toward the ground. "No, thank you. I think it's just stress. She's been so anxious lately, about everything. I don't understand it, but it's as if she's carrying a weight that she doesn't want to share." Miss Marple took a step closer, her voice gentle. "You've noticed, then, that something's troubling her. I imagine it must be difficult for you, not knowing what's going on." Clara nodded, her expression growing more solemn. "It's strange. Aunt Eleanor has always been so composed, so in control of everything. But lately she's been different. She's distant, secretive. I'm not sure what to make of it." The young woman's honesty struck a chord with Miss Marple. Clara had no illusions about her aunt's behavior, and she seemed genuinely concerned, though still in the dark about the true nature of the situation. Miss Marple decided to proceed with caution, not wanting to reveal too much just yet. "I'm sure your aunt is just going through a rough patch," Miss Marple said soothingly. "But it might help if you were to talk to her more, to understand what's going on in her life. Sometimes, when people keep things to themselves, it only makes the burden heavier." Clara's eyes brightened slightly at Miss Marple's words, but the tension didn't leave her face. She hesitated for a moment before speaking again, her voice lower now, almost as if she were sharing a secret. "I don't know, Miss Marple," she said quietly. "But I think it has something to do with the inheritance. Aunt Eleanor's been acting strange ever since she got the lawyer's letter. She's been talking about selling the property, but whenever I ask her why, she just changes the subject." Miss Marple's heart skipped a beat. The inheritance, the very thing Eleanor had mentioned in their conversation the previous evening. She had thought Clara might be unaware of the full scope of her aunt's troubles, but here was evidence that the young woman had pieced some of it together on her own. Miss Marple felt a surge of both concern and resolve. This was not a situation that could be left to fester. The truth needed to come to light, and quickly. "I see," Miss Marple said, her voice steady. "It's not uncommon for people to be hesitant about discussing money and property, especially when there are complicated feelings involved. But if you have any concerns about what's been happening with your aunt's inheritance, I think it would be wise to share them." Clara met her gaze, her brow furrowing in thought. I don't know what to think. Aunt Eleanor hasn't been open with me about the details, but I know she's scared. I don't know if it's the inheritance itself that's causing her fear, or if it's someone connected to it." Miss Marple's mind raced as she absorbed this new information. Someone connected to the inheritance. That was the key, she thought. Eleanor's brother, Charles, had made dangerous enemies that seemed to be lurking in the shadows, waiting for their moment to strike. If Clara was right, the danger was not just in the inheritance itself, but in the people who were after it, or after something far more sinister. "You must be careful, Clara," Miss Marple advised gently. "Sometimes when secrets are buried for so long, they tend to resurface when we least expect it. And the people who hold the secrets, they don't always have good intentions." Clara nodded, her expression thoughtful but troubled. "I'll try to talk to Aunt Eleanor more. I just wish she'd let me in, let me help." Miss Marple gave her a reassuring smile. "You're doing the right thing by being there for her. But remember, Clara, some things take time to reveal themselves, and when they do, you'll need to be prepared." With that, Miss Marple turned to leave, but she paused at the edge of the square, her eyes scanning the peaceful streets. Beneath the tranquility of St. Mary's, there was a storm brewing, one that had the potential to tear apart the lives of everyone involved. She could sense it now, more than ever, and she knew that the only way to stop it was to uncover the truth, no matter how dark it might be. Miss Marple sat in her cottage, the fire crackling softly in the hearth, but her mind was far from the warmth of the flames. She stared into the embers, her thoughts racing as the events of the past few days unfolded. Before her, like a well-worn story, the pieces of the puzzle were slowly beginning to fit together, though the picture they formed was still clouded, shrouded in secrecy and suspicion. Eleanor, Clara, and the mysterious inheritance left behind by her late brother, Charles. Each thread seemed to lead deeper into a dark web of secrets, lies, and hidden dangers. It had been days since her conversation with Clara, and Miss Marple had used the time wisely, observing, listening, and considering every angle of the case. She had spoken to a few of the village residents, none of whom had any direct information, but who had offered subtle hints about Eleanor's brother, Charles, and his reputation. He had been a man of influence, but not in a way that inspired admiration. Rumors of shady business dealings and a penchant for associating with unsavory characters had always clung to him, even in death. And now, it seemed, those very associations were rising again, threatening to drag Eleanor, and perhaps Clara, into their grasp. Miss Marple's attention returned to the small pile of papers on the table before her. These were the documents Eleanor had reluctantly shared with her, the ones concerning Charles's estate. She had gone over them several times, each time with a deeper sense of foreboding. There was something about the language in the lawyer's letters, something in the way they were written, that struck her as odd. The terms of the inheritance were convoluted, laden with conditions and stipulations that didn't seem entirely above board. And the mention of a second beneficiary, someone who was not named but referenced cryptically, added a layer of intrigue to the already complicated situation. The more Miss Marple thought about it, the more convinced she became that Eleanor had been caught in the middle of something far larger than a mere inheritance dispute. Charles's life had been riddled with shadows, and now those shadows were creeping into the lives of his sister and niece. Miss Marple could almost feel the danger lurking just beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to strike. Her reverie was interrupted by a soft knock at the door. She rose from her chair, smoothing her dress, and opened it to find Clara standing on the doorstep, her face pale and drawn, eyes wide with worry. "Miss Marple, I need your help," Clara said, her voice trembling slightly. "It's Aunt Eleanor. She's gone missing." The words hit Miss Marple like a cold gust of wind. Gone missing. Eleanor, the poised and dignified woman who had always maintained such control, vanishing without a trace. It didn't make sense, not in the way Clara had spoken it. Something was terribly wrong. Clara stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, her eyes scanning the room as if searching for answers that weren't there. "I came this morning to check on her. I thought she was just resting, but she's not in her room. Her things are all still. Here, but she's gone. I can't find her anywhere." Miss Marple's mind whirled. Eleanor had been nervous, yes, but to leave without a word. No, this wasn't simply a case of someone walking out of their own home. This felt like something far more sinister, a carefully orchestrated disappearance designed to look like a simple absence. "Have you spoken to anyone else?" Miss Marple asked, her voice calm but authoritative. "Has anyone seen her?" Clara shook her head, her expression growing more frantic by the second. "No one. I've asked around, but no one's seen her since yesterday afternoon. I don't know what to do." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, her gaze shifting to the pile of papers on the table. Eleanor's sudden disappearance was no coincidence. Of that Miss Marple was certain. It was clear that something had happened to force her hand, something that made her leave behind the safety of her home and go into hiding. Or worse. "Clara," Miss Marple said, her tone firm, "I need you to tell me everything you know about your aunt's recent activities, everything you've seen or heard, no matter how small. It's important." Clara hesitated, biting her lip, her hands wringing the hem of her coat. I don't know much. But there's something I haven't told you, Miss Marple. Something I only found out yesterday. Aunt Eleanor's been meeting with someone. I saw them together once, in the garden. It was late and they were talking quietly. I couldn't hear everything, but I saw the man. He looked familiar, but I couldn't place him. Miss Marple's interest piqued. A man. Who was he? And why had Eleanor been meeting him in secret? "Did you see his face clearly?" she asked, her voice calm but pressing. Clara shook her head, looking frustrated with herself. "No, not clearly, but I swear I've seen him before. I think he's one of the people my aunt used to know. Someone from her past. Someone she didn't talk about." Miss Marple felt a sudden shift in the atmosphere. The web was tightening. The connection between Eleanor's disappearance and the mysterious inheritance was becoming clearer with each passing moment. Someone was trying to keep her from finding out the truth, and Miss Marple knew that she had to act quickly before that someone did something far worse. "I think we need to go to Eleanor's house," Miss Marple said, standing up and gathering her things. "There may be clues there, things she left behind that could help us understand what's going on." Clara nodded, her face a mask of worry but also determination. "I'll come with you. I have to find her. I can't just sit here and wait." Together, they made their way to Eleanor's cottage, each step taking them deeper into the mystery. Miss Marple's mind raced, piecing together the puzzle in her mind. Eleanor had been hiding something, that much was certain. But what was it? And who had she been, meeting in secret? As they reached the front door, Miss Marple turned to Clara, her eyes steady. "Clara, you must be careful. Whoever is involved in this is dangerous, but together we'll find your aunt. I promise you." With that, they stepped into the house, and the door clicked shut behind them, sealing them into a world where nothing was as it seemed. The inside of Eleanor's cottage was eerily still, as if the house itself was holding its breath. Miss Marple and Clara stood in the small entryway, the air thick with a sense of foreboding. The cottage, usually so warm and inviting, felt hollow now, its walls seemingly echoing with the silence left behind by Eleanor's sudden disappearance. Miss Marple's eyes scanned the room, taking in the familiar details: framed photographs on the walls, a well-worn armchair by the hearth, a vase of fresh flowers on the mantel. But it was the absence of Eleanor herself that lingered in the air like a palpable weight. Clara moved slowly through the house, her footsteps hesitant, her gaze flickering from room to room as though expecting to find her aunt hiding behind one of the doors, ready to explain everything. But the rooms were empty, untouched, as though time had stood still in Eleanor's absence. It was a chilling thought. Eleanor had not packed a bag, nor had she left any sign of her departure. Everything seemed to indicate that she had simply vanished. Miss Marple, ever observant, began to move with purpose, her sharp eyes taking in every detail of the cottage, searching for something, anything that might explain where Eleanor had gone, or what had caused her to leave so suddenly. The soft creak of the floorboards beneath her feet was the only sound that filled the silence. "Clara, do you know if your aunt had any particular places she frequented? Any rooms she liked to keep to herself?" Miss Marple asked, her voice calm but insistent, breaking the silence with a sense of urgency. Clara shook her head, her expression anxious. "I'm not sure. She's always been a private person, but I don't know. She never mentioned anything specific. I just don't understand it, Miss Marple. She's never done anything like this before." Miss Marple nodded, her mind working quickly. Eleanor's disappearance didn't feel like an impulsive act. It was too calculated, too deliberate. This wasn't a case of someone simply leaving. It was as though someone had carefully arranged for Eleanor to vanish without a trace. Her eyes fell on a small table near the door. There was a piece of paper lying there, half hidden beneath a stack of books. Miss Marple moved toward it, her fingers brushing lightly over the paper as she picked it up. It was a letter, though the writing was not familiar. The words were neatly scrawled, but the ink seemed fresh, almost as though it had been written recently. She unfolded the letter, her eyes scanning the lines quickly. It was brief, but its contents were unmistakable. The letter mentioned Eleanor, urging her to meet the writer in person at a secluded location for a final discussion about the inheritance. The letter was unsigned, but it didn't need to be. Miss Marple's instincts told her everything she needed to know. The letter was a summons, one that had clearly played a role in Eleanor's disappearance. Clara stepped closer, her eyes widening when she saw the letter in Miss Marple's hand. "Who is this from? Do you think Aunt Eleanor went to meet them?" Miss Marple folded the letter back into her hands, her face thoughtful. "I believe your aunt has been coerced into meeting someone. Whoever wrote this letter is likely involved in her disappearance, but I fear there may be more to it than just a simple exchange over the inheritance. This is no ordinary business matter." Clara's face grew pale as she absorbed Miss Marple's words. "Do you think she's in danger?" she asked, her voice trembling. Miss Marple turned toward her, her expression soft but resolute. "I believe that your aunt's fears are well-founded. Whoever is behind this is not someone who is willing to let go of the inheritance without a fight, and Eleanor may have become a pawn in a much larger game." Clara nodded, her eyes darting nervously around the room. Miss Marple could see the uncertainty in her gaze, the fear that had taken root since her aunt's disappearance. The pieces of the puzzle were slowly falling into place, but there were still so many unknowns. Who was the person behind the letter? And what were they after? Miss Marple's thoughts were interrupted as she turned toward the small study at the back of the cottage. It was a room Eleanor had always used for her personal correspondence, and Miss Marple had a strong suspicion that something in there might shed more light on the mystery. She motioned for Clara to follow her and led the way into the study. The room was as tidy as the rest of the cottage, with bookshelves lining the walls and a large desk in the center. The faint smell of lavender still lingered in the air, and a small lamp burned softly on the desk. Miss Marple's eyes scanned the room, her gaze landing on a set of drawers tucked away beneath the desk. She moved toward them, her fingers expertly pulling them open one by one. Each drawer contained various pieces of correspondence. Some letters, others legal documents, all neatly filed away. But it was the last drawer that caught her attention. It was slightly ajar, as if it had been hastily closed. Miss Marple slid it open, her breath catching when she saw what lay inside. It was a folder, thick with papers, its edges worn as though it had been handled frequently. Miss Marple pulled it out carefully, her heart racing as she opened it. Inside were documents detailing the estate, Charles's will, the legal terms of the inheritance, and several other papers that Miss Marple couldn't quite make sense of. But there, at the back of the folder, was something else. A name. An unfamiliar one, but one that made Miss Marple's blood run cold. It was the same name that had been mentioned in the letter. The same name that, until now, had remained hidden from view. Miss Marple's fingers trembled slightly as she traced the name on the page. It was the name of a man, someone connected to Charles's past, someone who had been left out of the official record but whose influence over the inheritance was undeniable. The connection between this man and the mystery that surrounded Eleanor's disappearance was becoming clearer by the second. She closed the folder, turning to Clara, who was watching her with a mixture of hope and fear. "Clara," Miss Marple said quietly, "I believe we now have a name to go on, and I think it's time we learned more about him." Clara looked at her with wide eyes. "You mean, you know who he is?" Miss Marple nodded slowly. "I do, and I believe he holds the key to finding your aunt." The weight of the revelation hung in the air, but Miss Marple knew that this was only the beginning. The road ahead would be fraught with danger, but she had no intention of backing down. Not now, not when the truth was so close. The morning after Miss Marple had uncovered the startling connection between Eleanor's inheritance and the mysterious figure behind it, a thick fog clung to the village of St. Mary's, wrapping the cottages in a veil of uncertainty. The quiet streets, normally so full of life, now felt suffocating, as though the entire town was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Miss Marple's mind, however, was already in motion, the pieces of the puzzle falling into place with a steady rhythm. She had spent the early hours of the morning reflecting on the documents she had found in Eleanor's study and the name that had appeared on the papers. Jonathan Hale. He was not a man known to the village, not someone whose name had ever been spoken in the same breath as St. Mary's quiet reputation. But it was clear now that Hale was not only a part of Eleanor's past, but also a key figure in the dangerous game that had unfolded around the inheritance. Miss Marple knew that finding him would be the next logical step. The name in her hands was no longer a mystery. It was a lead, and it was time to follow it. Clara, who had spent the night at Miss Marple's cottage, was still asleep when Miss Marple rose early and slipped into her warmest coat. She moved quietly through the house, careful not to wake the young woman who had been deeply affected by the events of the last few days. Clara's nerves were frayed, her trust in the people around her shaken. She had been relying on her aunt for guidance and support, and now Eleanor was missing, her whereabouts unknown. The burden had fallen to Miss Marple to uncover the truth, and the stakes had never been higher. Miss Marple's first stop was the village's local archives, a small, dusty room in the back of the town hall, where decades of records and forgotten stories lay neatly stacked in boxes. The room smelled of aged paper and wood, the kind of scent that spoke of long-forgotten secrets waiting to be unearthed. She approached the elderly archivist, a man named Mr. Carrington, who was always eager to help when it came to matters of history. "Good morning, Mr. Carrington," Miss Marple said as she greeted the man behind the desk. "I'm hoping you can assist me with some research regarding a man named Jonathan Hale." Mr. Carrington looked up from his work, his round glasses perched on the edge of his nose. His eyebrows knitted in thought as he processed the name. "Jonathan Hale," he repeated. "That's an unusual name. I don't believe I've ever heard it come up in these records, but I can check for you. What's your interest in him?" Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her voice low. "I'm conducting some research on a matter of local history. Hale was involved in a rather complicated legal matter several years ago, and I believe there may be some records here that could shed light on his background." Mr. Carrington didn't question her further, though his curiosity was piqued. He shuffled through some of the files behind the desk, pulling out a heavy ledger that creaked as it opened. "Let me see what I can find," he muttered, flipping through the pages with care. Miss Marple watched him for a moment, her mind already racing ahead. She had a strong sense that Jonathan Hale's presence in St. Mary's was no coincidence. Whoever he was, whatever connection he had to Eleanor's brother, Charles, it was clear that his influence had left a lasting mark on the village, even if the town itself had long since forgotten about him. After a few moments of scanning the pages, Mr. Carrington looked up. "There's something here, but it's from quite some time ago. A mention of a Jonathan Hale, connected to a legal dispute with the Walters family, about 30 years ago. It appears he was involved in some sort of property issue. A rather contentious one, I gather. The records are sparse, but there's a reference to a settlement, nothing too specific, just a name attached to a property transaction. Perhaps that's what you're looking for." Miss Marple's pulse quickened. This was it, the first real lead she had uncovered about Hale. A legal dispute with the Walters family. That was Eleanor's maiden name. Miss Marple's mind began to put the pieces together. Eleanor's brother, Charles, had surely been involved in that dispute. Was this the source of the dangerous relationship between Charles and Hale? Had Hale been the man pulling the strings, manipulating Charles for his own gain? "Do you have any more details about this settlement?" Miss Marple pressed, her voice steady despite the surge of excitement she felt. Mr. Carrington looked through the ledger again, his fingers flipping the pages until he found another entry. "Ah, here it is. It says the matter was settled through a lawyer. Odd, no direct involvement from Jonathan Hale himself, just his name as a reference. The settlement was made, and it appears that the parties involved agreed to some sort of non-disclosure. Very hush-hush, no doubt about it." Miss Marple's mind raced, but she kept her face composed. A non-disclosure agreement, a legal settlement. All of this pointed to something far more insidious than a mere property dispute. There was a pattern here, a carefully orchestrated sequence of events designed to cover up something much larger. "Do you have the name of the lawyer involved?" Miss Marple asked, her voice calm but insistent. Mr. Carrington scanned the page once more, his finger tracing the faded ink. The lawyer's name was Lawrence Crane. Not familiar with him, I must admit, but it's a start. If you're looking into this matter further, I'd suggest starting with him. Miss Marple nodded, her thoughts already turning to the next step. She had a name, Lawrence Crane, and a connection to Jonathan Hale. She was closer now, closer than ever before, to unraveling the truth. After thanking Mr. Carrington for his help, Miss Marple stepped out into the misty morning, her mind alive with possibilities. There was still much to uncover, but now she had a clearer sense of the road ahead. Jonathan Hale was no stranger to the shadows, and it was clear that his influence had woven itself deeply into the fabric of St. Mary's. The village had long since moved on from the old disputes, but Miss Marple knew that in this case, the past had a way of catching up with everyone. With Lawrence Crane in her sights, Miss Marple was ready to follow the next lead. She had no doubt that, in time, the truth would come to light. But she also knew that some truths came at a price. As she walked through the village, the fog beginning to lift, she couldn't shake the feeling that Eleanor's disappearance was just the beginning. The real danger lay ahead, and it was only a matter of time before Miss Marple uncovered it, piece by piece. The following morning, as the fog from the night before began to lift, Miss Marple found herself standing at the front door of Lawrence Crane's office. It was an unassuming building, tucked away on a quiet street in the center of St. Mary's, its worn sign barely visible behind ivy and the creeping passage of time. Miss Marple had taken the opportunity to visit Crane after discovering his name linked to the mysterious settlement involving Jonathan Hale. Though her initial research had only scratched the surface, Miss Marple was certain that this lawyer knew more than he let on. She took a deep breath and knocked. The sound echoed through the small hallway, followed by a shuffling noise from inside. The door opened slowly, revealing a man in his late 50s, his features sharp and tired, as though the weight of years spent in law had taken its toll. He had a certain guarded air about him, his expression a mixture of curiosity and wariness. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice low, the hint of suspicion lurking beneath the politeness. "Good morning, Mr. Crane. My name is Jane Marple. I'm conducting some research regarding an old legal matter, and I was hoping to speak with you about it," she said, her tone calm but confident, her eyes fixed on his. Crane's eyes narrowed slightly, as if measuring the woman standing before him. "Research, you say?" He stepped back from the door, offering her a thin smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Come in, then. But I must warn you, Miss Marple, I don't often entertain visitors for matters of curiosity." Miss Marple entered the dimly lit office, her gaze taking in the stacks of files and the cluttered desk. It was the office of a man who had seen many years of legal work, a place filled with both the weight of responsibility and the marks of age. Crane gestured for her to sit, and Miss Marple accepted, her hands folding neatly in her lap. "I understand you were involved in a settlement many years ago," Miss Marple began, her voice measured. "A settlement involving the Walters family, Jonathan Hale, and a property dispute." Crane's face shifted slightly, the subtle change not lost on Miss Marple. The mention of Hale's name seemed to unsettle him, if only for a moment. He cleared his throat, leaning back in his chair as though weighing his words carefully. "That's quite a long time ago, Miss Marple," Crane said, his voice growing more guarded. "I'm not sure why you're asking about such things now. These matters were settled and there's no need to revisit them." "I believe there is," Miss Marple replied, her voice gentle but firm. "You see, Mr. Crane, I've come across some information that suggests there's more to the story than what was originally presented. I have reason to believe that Jonathan Hale's involvement wasn't entirely above board." Crane stiffened, his fingers tapping nervously against the desk. "That's an accusation you're making, Miss Marple. I'm afraid you'll need more than just a hunch to back that up." "I have more than a hunch," Miss Marple said softly, leaning slightly forward in her chair. "I have facts. The question is, Mr. Crane, what do you know about Hale's involvement, and what was it that led you to settle the dispute so quietly, without bringing any of it to light?" For a long moment, there was silence between them, the only sound the faint ticking of an old clock on the wall. Crane's gaze seemed to falter, and Miss Marple could see the hesitation in his eyes. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he spoke, his voice low and resigned. "You're right," he said quietly. "It wasn't just a simple property dispute. Hale had his hand in many things in the Walters family. Well, they were caught in the middle of it all." He paused, glancing out the window before continuing. "Hale wasn't the kind of man you crossed, not if you wanted to keep your life, your livelihood, intact. He knew how to make people disappear, how to twist things in his favor. I wasn't the only one who bent to his will." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. This was the breakthrough she had been hoping for. "And Charles Walters, was he involved in this?" Crane's eyes flicked toward the window again, his hands clasping together as he looked down at the desk. "Yes, Charles was deeply involved, but he wasn't as smart as he thought he was. Hale played him like a fiddle, pushed him into making deals he didn't understand. But I'll tell you this, Miss Marple, Charles didn't know everything. There were things Hale kept from him, things that went far beyond property or money." "Such as?" Miss Marple asked, leaning forward, her voice urging him to continue. Crane hesitated, his fingers pressing into the wood of the desk as though the memory of it all pained him. I can't speak to all of it, but I do know Hale had dealings with some very dangerous people, and when it came time to settle, it wasn't just about the inheritance, it was about power, influence, and control. Hale had his sights set on more than just property. He wanted control over the entire village, Miss Marple, and Charles was just a pawn in that. The weight of his words sank in, and Miss Marple's mind raced. Hale's ambitions were far larger than she had ever imagined. What had started as a simple inheritance dispute had escalated into something far more complex and far more dangerous. Eleanor's fears now made sense. She had been caught in the aftermath of a far-reaching plot, and Miss Marple was beginning to understand the full scope of the danger she faced. "Did Hale threaten Eleanor?" Miss Marple asked, her voice a little softer now, as though she were trying to piece together the final threads of the mystery. Crane's face tightened, his lips pressed into a thin line. He didn't need to. Eleanor was always the more cautious one. She saw what Hale was capable of. She knew better than to challenge him, but I think she underestimated the lengths he would go to. And now she's gone, Miss Marple said softly, more to herself than to Crane. She's disappeared because of it. Crane didn't answer immediately, his eyes dark with the weight of regret. Finally, he looked up, meeting Miss Marple's gaze. "You need to be careful, Miss Marple," he said quietly. "Hale's reach goes far. You're not the only one asking questions." Miss Marple nodded, standing up slowly, her mind swirling with the implications of what Crane had just revealed. Hale was a man who wielded influence like a weapon, and Eleanor's disappearance was a consequence of that power. But Miss Marple wasn't one to back down, no matter how dangerous the game had become. The truth was within reach. She could feel it, and she would find it, no matter where it led. The shadows in the small village of St. Mary's seemed to lengthen as the day wore on, but Miss Marple's steps remained steady and sure as she made her way back to Eleanor's cottage. The pieces of the puzzle were coming together, but with each new discovery, the danger became more palpable. Jonathan Hale's name, once just a distant whisper, had become central to everything that had happened to Eleanor and her family. And now, with the latest revelation from Lawrence Crane, Miss Marple knew there was no turning back. She had learned much from Crane's reluctant confession, but there was still so much left to uncover. Hale's influence over the Walters family, his ties to dark dealings beyond the village, and the secrets he had buried so carefully. All of it painted a picture that was far darker than Miss Marple had ever imagined. Eleanor had been right to be afraid, but Miss Marple knew it wasn't too late. The truth was still out there, waiting to be found, and with it, the key to understanding why Eleanor had vanished. As Miss Marple reached the door of the cottage, she hesitated for a moment. The quiet of the house, the stillness of the surrounding village, it all seemed at odds with the mounting tension she felt. She had hoped to find some clue, some sign that Eleanor had left behind. But so far, the cottage had remained a silent witness to her absence. Stepping inside, Miss Marple paused, taking in the familiar surroundings. The room was as she had left it, save for the letter that had been left on the small table. It was still there, but now its significance felt even greater. It had been written by someone who knew Eleanor well, someone who had used fear to manipulate her. But why? And why now? These were the questions that nagged at Miss Marple, but she knew she could not answer them just yet. Clara had returned to the cottage the day before, still visibly shaken by her aunt's disappearance. She had not yet returned to the house, but Miss Marple had a feeling that it wouldn't be long before she did. There were still things Clara didn't know, things that Miss Marple had not yet shared with her, but those things had to wait until Eleanor was found and the danger that loomed over the village was finally brought into the light. With a sigh, Miss Marple walked over to the small writing desk near the window. There, tucked away in the drawer, were a few more papers. Legal documents, contracts, and notes that Miss Marple had already seen, but something about the way they were arranged struck her. She moved them aside carefully, her fingers brushing against the edges of the papers. Beneath them, hidden from view, was something new. A small envelope, its edges frayed with age. It wasn't like the other documents, which had been neat and formal. This one felt personal, something that hadn't been meant to be seen by others. Miss Marple's heart quickened as she pulled it from the drawer. The envelope was unmarked, but the weight of it in her hands felt significant. She opened it slowly, the paper inside yellowed with age, its surface creased as though it had been folded and refolded countless times. The letter inside was brief, written in a hurried hand, but the words were unmistakable. "Meet me at midnight, the old mill. Don't bring anyone. The deal must be completed." The letter's contents sent a chill through Miss Marple. Midnight, the old mill, a place of little importance to most, but one that Miss Marple knew well. It was situated on the outskirts of the village, a crumbling relic of a time long past, now abandoned and forgotten by most. But Miss Marple knew it was no coincidence that the letter had directed Eleanor there. Midnight was not a time for casual meetings. It was a time for secrecy, for danger. And in the dark of the night, anything could happen. For a moment, Miss Marple stood still, the letter clutched tightly in her hands. This was the breakthrough she had been waiting for. It confirmed what she had suspected all along. Eleanor had been lured away, forced into a meeting that had everything to do with Jonathan Hale and his hidden dealings. The mill was the place where the final act would unfold, where the truth would either be revealed or buried forever. And Miss Marple could not afford to let it remain buried any longer. She knew she couldn't go alone. Clara needed to be kept in the loop, but for now, Miss Marple needed to act quickly. There was no time to waste. The only thing she could do now was to go to the mill, to confront the truth head-on. If Hale was there, if he had somehow orchestrated Eleanor's disappearance, then Miss Marple would make sure he couldn't hide behind his lies any longer. As Miss Marple prepared to leave, she was interrupted by a soft knock at the door. Clara had arrived earlier than expected, her face pale but determined as she entered the cottage. There was no denying the fear in her eyes, but also something else. Something that Miss Marple had seen in the faces of those who knew they were on the cusp of something important, something that could change everything. "Miss Marple, I've been thinking," Clara began, her voice trembling slightly. "I can't just sit here while you search for my aunt. If you're going to find her, I want to help her. I need to know what happened. Please, let me come with you." Miss Marple studied Clara for a long moment, seeing the resolve in her face. The young woman had made her decision, and Miss Marple knew there was no stopping her now, but this was no place for someone like Clara, not if what Miss Marple suspected was true. The danger was too great, and the risk of getting caught in the middle of a tangled web of deceit was too high. "You must stay here, Clara," Miss Marple said softly, her voice kind but firm. "This is something I have to do alone." Clara's eyes welled with tears, but she nodded, her shoulders slumping with resignation. "Please, Miss Marple, be careful. You don't know what you're up against." Miss Marple gave her a reassuring smile. "I'll be fine, Clara. The truth is always worth the risk." With that, she left the cottage, the weight of the night ahead pressing down on her. The mill was waiting, and so was Jonathan Hale, and Miss Marple had no intention of letting him slip away again. The truth was within her grasp, and she was determined to uncover it, no matter what it took. The old mill loomed ahead as Miss Marple approached, its silhouette barely visible against the fading twilight. The crumbling structure, once a bustling hub of industry, now stood as a forgotten relic on the outskirts of St. Mary's. The wind whistled through the broken windows, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and decay. It was a place of shadows, a place that seemed to have been left behind by time itself, its presence both eerie and foreboding. Miss Marple felt the weight of the evening press in on her as she stepped closer. The moon, pale and distant, cast long shadows across the overgrown path leading to the mill, and the silence around her was unsettling, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves. Everything about this place whispered of secrets, of things hidden in the dark and never meant to see the light of day. The letter had been clear. Midnight. The old mill. And here she was, standing at the threshold of the truth, or perhaps something far darker. Her heart beat steadily in her chest, but there was a quiet determination in her movements. She had faced countless mysteries in her lifetime, but this one felt different. The stakes were higher. Eleanor's disappearance had been the spark, but the fire that had followed threatened to consume everything in its path. Jonathan Hale was no longer just a name. He was the architect of a conspiracy that reached far deeper than Miss Marple had ever imagined. She stepped into the mill, the floor creaking beneath her feet as she moved cautiously, her eyes adjusting to the dim light filtering through the broken roof. The air inside was thick with dust, the remnants of forgotten years hanging heavy in the stillness. The beams above groaned in protest, as if the mill itself was protesting her presence. There was no sign of anyone, no footsteps, no voices. But Miss Marple had learned long ago that silence was often the most telling sign of all. Her eyes swept across the room, searching for any clue that might give away the purpose of this meeting. The moonlight flickered through the gaps in the walls, casting an eerie glow on the worn wooden beams and broken machinery. Then, just as she was about to move further into the mill, a figure emerged from the shadows. A man, tall and broad-shouldered, stepped forward. His features were obscured by the darkness, but Miss Marple knew, instinctively, who it was. "Jonathan Hale, Miss Marple," he said, his voice smooth with an almost amused edge. "I had a feeling you'd show up. I don't suppose you've come here to talk about the weather." She didn't flinch at the sound of his voice. Instead, she stood firm, her eyes narrowing slightly. "I've come to find out the truth, Mr. Hale, about Eleanor, about what you've been hiding." Hale's lips twisted into a smile, but it was a cold, calculating expression that made the hairs on the back of Miss Marple's neck stand up. "Ah, Eleanor. I was wondering when her name would come up. She's a stubborn woman, isn't she? Always thinking she can control things. But you know, Miss Marple, sometimes the things we try to control end up controlling us." Miss Marple took a step closer, her gaze never wavering from him. "What have you done to her? Where is she?" Hale's smile faltered slightly, the amusement fading from his eyes as he seemed to weigh her words. "Eleanor's not lost, Miss Marple. She's simply out of sight for a time. You see, the problem with people like her, and you for that matter, is that you think you understand the game, but you don't. None of you do." "You're the one who doesn't understand," Miss Marple said quietly, her voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "This isn't a game. People's lives are at stake. Eleanor's life is at stake, and I'll find her, whether you like it or not." Hale's eyes darkened, and for a moment, the veneer of calm he had carefully cultivated cracked. "You're too late," he said, his voice cold and full of menace. "Eleanor is a part of something much bigger than you, bigger than this village. She always has been. You think you can stop me, but you're just a step behind, Miss Marple. Just a step." Miss Marple's heart raced, but she stood taller, her resolve hardening. "I don't need to stop you, Mr. Hale. I just need to expose you for what you really are." Hale's lips curled into a snarl, and for the first time Miss Marple saw the true nature of the man standing before her. He was no longer the smooth, calculating figure that had controlled so much from the shadows. In that moment, he was the embodiment of the very darkness he had spent years cultivating. Ruthless, dangerous, and desperate. "You think you know everything, don't you?" Hale said, his voice dripping with venom. "You think you can just waltz in here, poke around, and uncover everything, but you don't understand, Miss Marple. The power I hold, the people I control, They're not something you can just expose. They will bury you just as they buried Charles, just as they buried everything else. The mention of Charles made Miss Marple's blood run cold. She knew exactly what Hale was implying. He wasn't just talking about his influence in the village, he was talking about the people he had silenced, the people who had tried to stand in his way. Charles Walters had been one of them, and now Eleanor was caught in the same web, unable to escape. "You're wrong," Miss Marple said, her voice steady. "The truth always comes to light, and I'll make sure it does. Whatever you've done, whatever you think you've controlled, it's all unraveling, and you can't stop it." For a moment, Hale's eyes flashed with something like fear, but it was gone in an instant, replaced by the same cold calculation. "We'll see about that, won't we?" he said, his voice a low growl. Just then, Miss Marple heard a sound behind her, a faint rustling in the shadows. She turned quickly, but before she could react, the figure that emerged from the darkness was no longer Jonathan Hale. It was Eleanor, pale but standing tall, her eyes burning with a fierce determination. "I'm not going anywhere," Eleanor said, her voice firm. "Not while he's still trying to control everything." The truth was finally revealed. Hale's grip on Eleanor was weakening, and the final chapter of this dark story was beginning to unfold. Miss Marple had known it all along. The key to ending this nightmare lay in the courage of those who refused to be controlled. And now, with Eleanor standing at her side, Miss Marple knew that together they would expose the darkness once and for all. The mill stood silent in the wake of the confrontation, its old timbers groaning as the wind outside picked up. Eleanor stood resolute beside Miss Marple, the weight of everything that had happened finally settling into the space between them. Hale had been momentarily taken aback when Eleanor revealed herself from the shadows, but he had quickly regained his composure. His confidence, once so unshakable, now seemed brittle, like a fine thread stretched too tight. Miss Marple's gaze flicked between Hale and Eleanor, the room suddenly feeling smaller, as if the walls themselves were closing in on them. Hale, though caught off guard, still exuded a dangerous calm. His eyes were hard, but his voice faltered just enough to signal that the game was changing. "This was inevitable, you know," Hale said, his tone lowering, almost regretful, as if he were explaining something to a child who had failed to understand the rules. "You always thought you could stop me, but the truth is, Miss Marple, you never had the power to. It's been too long, too many strings pulled, too many people influenced. This village, these people, they're all part of something I've been controlling for years." Eleanor stood taller, her fists clenched at her sides. "You've been manipulating us all, Hale. All this time we've been pawns in your game, but no more." She glanced at Miss Marple, who gave her a small, encouraging nod. "You wanted control over this village, this inheritance, but you've underestimated us. You thought the truth would remain hidden, but it won't." Hale sneered. "You've always been so naive, Eleanor. Your brother, Charles, he was too weak, too trusting. He didn't understand that power is something you take, not something you inherit. He was a fool, just like you." Eleanor's face hardened. "Charles was a victim. He didn't realize the depths of what you were involved in. He never stood a chance." Miss Marple stepped forward now, her presence steady, unwavering. "You're wrong, Hale. The truth always comes out. No matter how many lies you spin, no matter how much control you think you have, there's always someone who will see through it, and that someone is me." Hale's eyes flickered with a fleeting flash of anger, but he quickly masked it, his features resuming their calculating composure. "You think you've won, Miss Marple? You think just because you've figured out a few pieces of this puzzle, you can stop me? It's over. You don't even know the full story." "Actually," Miss Marple replied, her voice calm and steady, "I believe I do." She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out the small bundle of papers she had found earlier in the cottage, documents she had kept hidden just in case. Hale's eyes widened for a brief moment before his expression darkened. "Those papers," he spat. "They mean nothing. You're too late. Everything is already in motion." "Not quite," Miss Marple said softly. "These documents you thought were buried. They were never meant to be found. But I've uncovered them, piece by piece. And now, I know everything. I know about your deals with the shadowy figures who financed your schemes, your attempts to control not just the Walters family, but the entire village." She unfolded the papers in front of him, each word on the pages a silent accusation. "You wanted power, Hale. You manipulated people, used them, destroyed their lives. Charles, Eleanor, and countless others were nothing more than pawns to you, but no longer. The truth is out now, and I've made sure the right people know everything." Hale's expression twisted in frustration, his gaze flicking between Miss Marple and Eleanor. He could see that his game was unraveling, that the threads of his control were slipping through his fingers. He had spent years weaving his influence into the fabric of St. Mary's, but now it was all coming undone. "You don't understand," Hale growled, his voice rising. "You can't stop it now. The people I've aligned myself with, they won't allow you to interfere. You don't know what you're up against." Miss Marple's eyes locked onto Hale's with a quiet intensity. "I know exactly what I'm up against. You've spent your life hiding in the shadows, Mr. Hale, but the truth has a way of surfacing, no matter how much you try to bury it." The sound of approaching footsteps cut through the tension in the room. Miss Marple turned slightly, her gaze shifting toward the doorway. 2 uniformed police officers appeared there, faces set in grim determination. They had arrived just in time, as she had anticipated. They had been following the trail of evidence Miss Marple had carefully pieced together, and now they had the final confirmation they needed. "You're under arrest, Hale," one of the officers said, his voice firm, "for the abduction of Eleanor Walters and for conspiracy to commit fraud. Your involvement in illegal dealings is now part of an ongoing investigation." Hale's face drained of color as the officers moved toward him, their hands reaching for his arms to cuff him. He struggled, but there was no escaping now. Miss Marple had ensured that every move he made had been carefully monitored, that every piece of the puzzle was in place for this very moment. "I've lost," Hale muttered under his breath, his shoulders slumping in defeat as the officers led him away. "I should have known better than to underestimate you, Miss Marple." As the sound of footsteps echoed through the mill, Miss Marple turned to Eleanor. There was a softness in her eyes, a quiet acknowledgement of the woman who had stood firm in the face of danger, refusing to let Hale's manipulation control her any longer. "It's over," Miss Marple said gently. "You're free now, Eleanor. The truth has come to light." Eleanor nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I don't know how to thank you, Miss Marple. You saved my life." Miss Marple smiled warmly. "You saved yourself, Eleanor. You had the courage to stand up even when it seemed like there was no way out." As the 2 women stood together in the dim light of the old mill, they knew the village of St. Mary's would never be the same. The dark influence of Jonathan Hale had been eradicated, and with it, the grip of fear that had held so many in its thrall. And though the road ahead would be long, the truth had finally prevailed, and justice had been served. For Miss Marple, there was a quiet satisfaction in the knowledge that once again, the truth had triumphed. The mystery had been solved, the villain unmasked, and the village of St. Mary's could breathe easy once more. The game was over, and justice had been restored.